Ireland had had a long and tumultuous history with England. It suffered centuries of invasions, wars, colonisation, and even English politics spilling into Ireland on several occasions. During the 19th century, Ireland was ruled directly from London as part of the United Kingdom. Inaction and neglect from the British government during the potato famine in Ireland led to millions of Irish people dying of starvation and disease, while millions more emigrated, ultimately halving the island's population by the 1890s. The Irish Republican Brotherhood emerged during the 19th century, and they wanted an Irish Republic. They mixed well with the Gaelic revival, a re-emergence of old Gaelic culture and language in Ireland. The Irish Home Rule movement gained traction in the British Parliament, wanting a parliament in Dublin once again. In Ireland, Arthur Griffith set up the party Sinn Féin in 1905, which meant we ourselves, believing that Irish members of Parliament should not go to London and instead establish an Irish Parliament in Dublin, comparing it to the two parliaments of Vienna and Budapest of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Home Rule gained loads of support during the 1910s, but not in Ulster, which was predominantly Protestant and Unionist, loyal to Britain. Most of Ireland's industry was centred in Ulster at that time, and they didn't want a parliament in Dublin, believing it would be run by the Catholic Church. They threatened war, forming the Ulster Volunteers. In response, the Irish Volunteers formed, and Ireland was on the brink of civil war. The Home Rule Bill was passed in the British Parliament, but the First World War broke out across Europe and Home Rule was put on hold. Most Irish volunteers signed up, but some stayed behind and secretly planned the Easter Rising. The leaders signed the Proclamation of Independence and captured Dublin. The British response was to shell the city, and many civilians were killed. The rebels surrendered after 6 days of fighting. They were promptly court-martialed and executed. Some military leaders, such as Eamon de Valera, avoided execution. Thousands of people were arrested, many not having anything to do with the rising. Seeing the harsh response by the British and the relentless executions of the leaders, many Irish people began to believe these men died for something, an Irish Republic. Many of the rebels who fought in the rising were sent to Frongoch internment camp in Wales. One such rebel who had fought in the GPO was the young Cork man Michael Collins. While imprisoned, Collins rose to lead the rebels in training, deciding that guerrilla warfare, such as ambushes, raids and hit-and-run tactics, would be much more effective than fighting the might of the British Army head-on. By December 1916, the prisoners in Frongoch were released and returned home to stir up support for the cause. In 1917, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George announced an amnesty for political prisoners such as Eamon de Valera, so they were released too. Many of the public believed that Sinn Féin was behind the Easter Rising, not the volunteers, so to match the public image, many volunteers joined Sinn Féin and reorganised it to match the Republican agenda, with de Valera as president. During 1917, rebel leader Thomas Ashe was rearrested, and him and many others went on hunger strike. He died, and more people rallied to the cause. The First World War was still raging in Europe, and the threat of conscription of Irish people led to even more anti-British sentiment. In May 1918, British authorities arrested dozens of leading members of Sinn Féin in one night. The leaders had been tipped off. Dev chose to be arrested and stir up more public outcry. Collins chose to avoid being captured so he could continue the fight on the ground. As the 1918 general elections approached, the Irish Labour Party chose not to run so as to not split the Irish vote. A united answer was needed regarding Irish independence, and thus Sinn Féin won a landslide victory. Constance Markievicz would be the first woman ever elected to the British Parliament. However, she and the rest of Sinn Féin chose not to take their seats in Westminster, and instead, on January 21st, 1919, they held the first Dáil Éireann, the first Parliament of Ireland, in the Mansion House in Dublin. They declared independence with Cathal Brugha as a temporary president, while Dev was still in jail. On the same day in Solohead Beg, County Tipperary, Irish volunteers ambushed RIC policemen, killing 2 and stealing a consignment of gelignite. The first shots of the Irish War of Independence had been fired. Volunteers across the country were told to treat British forces as an invading army, and they raided RIC barracks, stealing better weapons as they went. The war had begun. In February, Michael Collins and Harry Boland broke Dev out of Lincoln Prison in England. Intelligence was key in this war. The Dublin Metropolitan Police had a plain-clothed division known as G-Men, who would follow Sinn Féin members and keep track of their movements and activities. Ned Broy worked as a double agent in the police for the volunteers, copying files, explaining the whole police system, and indeed sneaking Michael Collins himself into the detective headquarters in Dublin so Collins could spend the night going through the files. In Limerick, amidst the chaos of the war, the people declared the Limerick Soviet, a socialist city named after the Soviets which had taken control of Russia only 2 years before. The people printed their own money, controlled food prices, and printed their own newspapers. It lasted only 2 weeks before Republicans and the Catholic Church turned against it. This was a common thread throughout the war, as socialist uprisings were suppressed by Irish nationalists, or indeed the British. The last thing they needed was socialist ideas spreading to English cities and crumbling the empire from within. Dublin TD Sean T. O'Kelly was in Paris trying to get some time with the US President Woodrow Wilson while the world leaders drafted the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. He didn't get too far. De Valera himself travelled to the United States to muster support and money for the Irish Republic, talking to many Irish-American groups and raising $5.5 million. He stayed in the States for 18 months, leaving effective command of the war to Collins. While Sinn Féin in the Dáil opted for a non-violent approach towards the Dublin police through mild intimidation, persuasion and boycotting, Collins believed that this wasn't enough. He had a group assembled who would become the Squad, who would target and assassinate G-men, making it more and more undesirable to work for the Crown. The Dáil became worried that the Irish volunteers were working too independently, and so they were reorganised into the Irish Republican Army, with Richard Mulcahy as their chief of staff. In Fermoy, County Cork, after IRA volunteers attacked British troops, killing 200 British troops looted and burnt the town. Meanwhile, Lloyd George had outlawed Dáil Éireann, but the British government was still exploring the possibility of Home Rule, with 2 parliaments, one in Dublin and one in Belfast. Sir John French, the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, believed this could work. The IRA tried to assassinate him in Phoenix Park in Dublin towards the end of 1919. In 1920, the British Secretary of State for War, Winston Churchill, put together a heavy-duty team of law enforcers, many veterans of the Great War. Due to the colours of their uniforms, the RIC Special Reserve gained the infamous nickname the Black and Tans. They were vicious and brutal, often taking reprisals for IRA attacks out on civilians. Tuam, Balbriggan, Thurles and many other towns would burn before the end of 1920. The north of Ireland was much more deeply divided, as the Ulster Unionists were still very much against Irish nationalists. In Derry elections, nationalists had taken control of the Londonderry Corporation. IRA attacks on RIC barracks increased across the province. The Ulster Volunteers arose to defend the Protestants of Ulster. Catholics in the waterside of Derry were driven out, and an attack was made on the bog side by the Ulster Volunteers and the British Army. In Belfast, 7,000 Catholic workers were driven out of their jobs in the shipyards by loyalists. There would be no surrender. The British war effort was hampered in many ways by Dublin dock workers and Irish rail workers refusing to carry British war materials or troops. Collins' squad's assassination campaign against G-men was leaving the British intelligence network thin, so they brought in their own operatives from England, who would later be known as the CAIRO gang. The Dáil courts had been set up to replace the British legal system, and Irish people began refusing to take part in British courts, bringing the justice system to a standstill. Many RIC policemen left, frustrated with the lack of justice. The RIC gained more reinforcement from the Auxiliary Division, who would gain a similar reputation to the Black and Tans. The British brought in internment without trial, throwing many suspected IRA members into jail unjustly. In April 1920, many in Mountjoy prison went on hunger strike, demanding political status. In August, prisoners in Cork went on hunger strike. Terence MacSwiney, Lord Mayor of Cork and elected Sinn Féiner, was imprisoned, so he joined the hunger strike. 3 died, including MacSwiney, after months of refusing to eat. MacSwiney's death in an English jail brought much international attention unwanted by Britain. The tit-for-tat attacks and reprisals continued throughout 1920, and the 21st of November saw one of the most infamous days in the war. Having gathered much information on the CAIRO gang from his inside man David Nelligan, Collins ordered the assassination of various British intelligence agents. At 9 a.m, 13 British operatives in various positions across Dublin were killed in a coordinated attack. 2 civilians were killed and another was wounded. That afternoon, the auxiliaries arrived at Croke Park to a Gaelic football match and opened fire on the crowd. 14 people were killed in the chaos. This day would become known as Bloody Sunday. Martial law spread across the country. In December, after an IRA attack on auxiliaries in Cork, British authorities set fire to Cork city centre. Fire brigades were delayed by the Black and Tans and civilians were shot at. At this time, Eamon de Valera returned from America to a country at war. Meanwhile, in Westminster, just before Christmas, the Government of Ireland Act 1920 came into law. Because of the strong unionist presence in the 6 northeastern counties, the Parliament in Belfast would control these counties, which would become Northern Ireland. The Dublin Parliament would control the other 26 counties, becoming Southern Ireland. Both would remain part of the United Kingdom, but Ireland was now divided. Because the Sinn Féin representatives hadn't taken their places in Westminster, the Act was very out of touch with the developments in Ireland. Many people in Ireland were beyond the point of no return when it came to being part of the British Empire. The IRA travelled in flying columns, guerrilla groups ready to attack, hiding from authorities in friendly houses or hideouts around the countryside. In January 1921, British authorities in Dripsey, County Cork, were tipped off about an IRA ambush by a local elderly woman, resulting in the deaths of 7 IRA men. Later, the IRA kidnapped and executed her and her chauffeur. In Dublin, the British patrols began bringing IRA prisoners along with them to deter grenade attacks. Curfews were brought in Dublin, and they began door-to-door searches. Early 1921 would see the bloodiest of the war. De Valera in the Dáil tried to gain some control back on this chaotic war. There had been tensions growing between Michael Collins and Cathal Brugha over the running of the IRA. Brugha was indeed the Minister of Defence, but the IRA looked more towards Collins for leadership. Dev didn't like the hit-and-run murderous tactics the IRA had been employing, so he moved for a more formal military action of capturing the Custom House in Dublin. Led by Oscar Traynor, this was a complete disaster, as they were very quickly outgunned by the British. 80 IRA men were captured and supplies for the Republican cause were running dangerously low. James Craig became the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. King George V himself opened the Parliament, calling for peace on the island. In June 1921, the British government decided to call a truce, not knowing how close the IRA was to actually collapsing. They were at a stalemate, and the fighting had to stop. Lloyd George wrote to De Valera, and they agreed on a truce. The day before it was to come into effect, the IRA killed 2 policemen during an RIC raid in Belfast, sparking huge sectarian riots and house burnings. This would be Belfast's Bloody Sunday. The truce came into effect nonetheless on the 11th of July 1921, and the fighting for the most part stopped. Michael Collins, Arthur Griffith and others travelled to England to negotiate a treaty. A republic or a 32-county united Ireland was never on the cards. The negotiations led to the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which created the 26-county Irish Free State, which would become a dominion of the British Empire in the same way as Canada or Australia. The King would still be head of state, and Britain would retain control over 3 strategic ports within the Free State. The treaty allowed Northern Ireland to opt out of the Free State, thus cementing partition on the island. Collins returned home with the treaty to a divided government. Some agreed that it was as good as they were going to get, Collins believing it would be a stepping stone to an Irish republic, the freedom to achieve freedom. Others, such as De Valera, refused to get behind the treaty. This bitter division in politics would soon lead to the Irish Civil War. But that's a story for another time. If you want to know more about the Irish War of Independence, you can buy my book, Manny Does Revolutionary Ireland. Not only does it cover the War of Independence, but also the Easter Rising and the Civil War. It's available online through the Collins Press or in most good Irish bookshops. It's filled with many more illustrations and even more detail I could never fit into these videos. Keep an eye out for my theatre tour of Manny Does the History of Ireland on stage in February-March of 2019. Produced by Angrianan Theatre, directed by Rachel Diver, and starring me and the hilarious Louise Connahan. It's a mad, fun telling of the history of Ireland, with all the tongue-in-cheek humour you've come to expect from Manny Man. The current dates are here, with possibly more dates to come. Find out more details on johndruddy.com. There's indeed books, t-shirts, posters and more to be found too on johndruddy.com. Don't forget to subscribe, follow me on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter. Help support the making of new videos on Patreon. Thank you very much to my current patrons. I'll keep the history coming.